Hi, welcome to this week's episode of In the Hoods. This week we're going to be talking about the East Village and its sub-neighborhoods of Little Ukraine and Alphabet City. The East Village really runs from Broadway on the west to 14th Street on the north, Houston Street on the south, and through Alphabet City all the way to the East River. When we talk about the East Village, what comes to mind again is a very bohemian neighborhood. It's in the 1960s and on, it was the site of many galleries and many artists lived there. But prior to that, it has an interesting history. Like most neighborhoods in New York, it was at one point settled after the Native Americans by the Dutch. And there were huge Dutch plantations along the area that is the East Village. And then after the Commission of 1811, where the grid pattern for Manhattan was developed, these plantations started being divided up and sold off as plots of land. And this area actually housed some of the biggest mansions in New York City in the early 1800s. Something that is little known. And it was considered one of the more affluent areas to live in. This did not last for long. As the push north happened, many people left this area and the mansions were demolished to be replaced largely by tenement-type housing. And the area became prevalent, particularly around 2nd Avenue, as an area for immigrants to come. And there was an area called, and it kind of melded with the Lower East Side. The population initially was largely German-speaking, and then in the early 1900s, Eastern European Jewish population arrived, the Ukrainian population arrived, settling along 2nd Avenue. Also, there was a large Polish population. Further east, where the avenues ceased to have numbers but became letters, avenues A, B, C, and D, all the way to the East River. Its development, this is the area we call Alphabet City, but that name really came later in its development. Early on, along the East River was a site of shipbuilding, and housing was built for the people who worked in the shipping yards. And much of this was tenement housing, which quickly became somewhat derelict housing, and it was considered a lower income area, which has really persisted. You had Tompkins Square Park, buildings built, some houses built around the park, but in the 1960s, many of these buildings were inhabited by squatters. Tompkins Square was known as a spot where in I think it was 68, there was the Tompkins Square riots, where people were demanding that they be allowed to inhabit the housing they'd been squatting in for years. And many of them were. They were grandfathered in, if you will. Many of these buildings had been worked on by the squatters. They made them whole again after they'd run down terribly. As in the 60s, again, the neighborhoods, a lot of the galleries moved out. They moved to Soho and more affluent areas. The village began to be gentrified by people coming in with money available to them, and the feel of the place began to change, and there began to be less of a differentiation between the East Village and Greenwich Village until you got over to 2nd Avenue. And then it was very Polish or Ukrainian. I remember going there, wonderful restaurants, some of which still exist. There's still an Ukrainian Catholic church down there that has been very active recently with what's going on in Ukraine. And further east, Alphabet City became inhabited largely by a Hispanic population and continues to today to be a lot of Spanish is spoken there. And I would say the housing is largely run down. There's a lot of city project type housing in Alphabet City. And for a while there, it was a very dangerous neighborhood. But the East Village, like all parts of New York, has tremendous history. And there have been some preservation efforts to preserve old buildings which have historic relevance, and we need to applaud that.